G'day and welcome to Perko's podcast, a podcast all about strategy, leadership and soul care. We're here to help you obtain your personal, professional and spiritual goals without losing your soul. We hope that today's episode is refreshing and gives you a new perspective. Now here's your host, Jason Perkins.
G'day everyone and welcome to episode 31 of Perko's podcast. It is a special episode today, soul care at Christmas time. In fact, today we're doing something very different. I won't be interviewing a guest. In fact, a previous guest of the podcast, my good friend Duncan Banks, all the way from London, England, who was my guest on episode 4 of the podcast when we first began, he is taking the host seat today, and he's going to be asking me some questions about how do we care for our soul during one of the busiest and maybe even most stressful times of the year, which is Christmas. So I'm super excited because Duncan is a lot of fun, and although he does ask me a number of questions throughout the conversation, Duncan actually shares some of his own personal insights and his own personal experiences from years of being a leader and having to care for his soul over the holiday season. So I think you're actually going to learn just as much from Duncan as you might be able to glean from my answers to his questions. But we also have some real fun along the way, so I hope you enjoy this episode. Hey, if you're brand new to the podcast, I just want to encourage you to head over to my website if you haven't already done so that you can sign up for our regular emails that we send out. My website is jasonperkoperkins.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter right there. We love sending out information to help you care for your soul, but also notifications to let you know when we've released a brand new podcast. Well, without any further ado, I want to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and let you know that to prepare you for the new year, I have a special episode of the podcast coming out right after Christmas with my good friend Sadara. Sadara was on the podcast early on as well, episode 7. And in this episode, to prepare for the new year, I actually walk Sadara through a tool that helps leaders to create what's referred to as a life manifesto, or maybe a dashboard for life. It was like a live coaching call with Sid, and it is a great way to help you focus on who you want to become in the new year and less on what you need to get done. So many of us in the new year, we set goals where we're focused on what we want to get done, but this particular tool helps you to focus on who you want to become. I love how Craig Rochelle describes it. He says it this way: focus on the who, not the do. So be on the lookout for that episode releasing right before the new year, and let me know if you would like some help working on your own life manifesto for the new year. I'd love to be able to help you out with that. The best way to connect with me is through the link in my Instagram bio. Again, my Insta handle is @JasonPerkoPerkins, and I'd love to help you discover who you want to become in the new year. Well, without any further ado, here is my conversation, Soul Care for the Holidays, with my good friend, Duncan Banks. Enjoy. Merry Christmas, Duncan. Welcome to Perko's podcast. So good to see you, mate. I love hanging out with you, mate. And this is a special edition of the podcast. I'm stoked about what we're about to do. How are you doing, though, before we dive in? How's things going in the UK preparing for Christmas?
Mate, we're just deciding how early is it, or is it good enough to put the tree up now? I mean, it's actually, it's a difficult decision to make. When do you put your tree up? So in our family, it's all very Christmassy, but we're not sure whether we're going too early with the Christmas tree and the decorations.
Yeah, well, we've always gauged it, Duncan. I say always. My wife and I have been married for 22 years. This month, actually, we're celebrating 22 years, and we've spent many of those years, 17, 18 of those years living in the United States, and they celebrate this thing called Thanksgiving. So as dual citizens, we still celebrate, even though we live in Australia now, we celebrate Thanksgiving. And that's always been the marker for us. Thanksgiving is at the end of November. and my wife would always hold out until after Thanksgiving to put up the Christmas decorations. So around the 1st of December, basically, or late November is when Christmas decorations go up in our place. So that's
it's got to be December.
Say that again.
It's got to be December. If it doesn't come in, you can't put your decorations up before December. You've got to put it up in the month of Christmas. I know for my mum, when I was growing up, she was always panicky about making sure food was cooked properly. So you could never stab a carrot. She would cook it so all the goodness would come out into the water. So it would just be mush, because she thought you had to cook everything. So her cue for starting Christmas dinner was basically Halloween.
Halloween.
That's when she, yeah. Okay. That's when she would put the Brussels sprouts on ready for Christmas Day. It's crazy, really.
Well, Duncan, we're doing something special, mate. You are taking over the podcast. This is unusual. I normally interview guests, including you. You were on the podcast at the very beginning, one of the early episodes. But today, Duncan, you are the host, and you're going to be asking me some questions, I believe, around soul care and the holidays, because we're getting ready for Christmas. So fire away, mate. It is over to you. Do whatever you like.
Oh, thanks, Jason. I'm so excited about this. I really am. I've been looking forward to it for ages. I've been telling all my friends about the fact that I'm getting to actually ask questions of Jason. I mean, he spends all his time on Perko's podcast, picking away at other people and asking them the tough questions. And I've seen some of the guests who push back from the microphone and think, oh man, that's a tough question. Well, I'm hoping I can ask you those questions, because I know for those of us, especially those of us in church leadership, time off over Christmas from work can often be time off from reality and time off from our relationship with the Father as well. So I'm really interested to know how you navigate Christmas. But before I get into that, paint a picture. I mean, I've got this idea of you and Kristen and the kids. I've got this idea of kind of like a Hollywood schmaltzy movie scene for you at Christmas. What's the Perkins traditions when it comes to Christmas? Paint me a picture of a traditional Perkins Christmas.
So for us, Duncan, it starts on Christmas Eve. We're big fans of celebrating Christmas in a big way, beginning on Christmas Eve. So we always, every year, we do Chinese takeout for Christmas Eve dinner. And we oftentimes have a lot of people over. In fact, when I was in full-time leadership role at a church, we would have our entire staff over after multiple services leading up to Christmas. We'd have sometimes 5 or 6 services on Christmas Eve, sometimes even Christmas Adam, as we called it, because Adam came before Eve, so the 24th. And so we'd wrap up on Christmas Eve, one of the final services, all head to our place, eat Chinese takeout, and open at least one present on Christmas Eve. That's pretty traditional for us. And then Christmas morning, big brunch is kind of our go-to. I have a pair of flannel pajamas, Duncan, that I've worn for probably nearly 20 years now. They only come out on Christmas morning, and I wear those to read the Christmas story, open the presents with the kids. But here in Australia now, one of our new traditions is we head to the beach because it's so warm at Christmas time. We decide to have brunch and then spend the afternoon at the beach. So those are some of our traditions on Christmas Eve and Christmas morning. So yeah.
Now I've got the picture in my mind. I've got the picture of you in these. Are they red flannel pajamas?
They are red check.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah. And if you've been wearing them every year for 20 years, they're about ready for a wash, I would imagine now, Jason. But I've just got this picture of you topless, sat with these flannel pajamas, reading the Christmas story. The kids are saying, "Dad, put the Bible down. I just want to open my presents." So I've got the whole picture. I can see it now. It's great.
That's it. That's exactly what it is. Without the topless, but yes, still the whole picture. I'm glad that's in your mind's eye, not mine.
So I'm so glad that you talked about reading the Christmas story. I mentioned that in a talk one year at our church years and years ago. That we as a family will just find a moment to light a candle, and I'll read, or one of the kids as they grew up read the Christmas story. And it was very brief and very simple, but very poignant around the Christmas time. And I was amazed at how many people, even today, will still say that's become part of our family tradition. Yeah. Just a simple little way of making sure Jesus stays front row center in the celebrations. So sure, we love the tinsel and and the unwrapping of the presents and the mulled wine and the mince pies. Of course, we love all that. And it's really hard sometimes to find a way of keeping your eyes fixed on the Savior. But that reading of the story, the family get together, the television screen goes off, and it just feels real. So I'm so glad you talked about that. It's fantastic. Hey, Jason, I've got a bunch of questions I want to ask you. I know, because I've known you now for 3 or 4 years, and I'm an avid listener of the podcast, I know that you've managed to weave some rhythms into your life to help you with soul care. Otherwise, caring for your soul gets neglected unless you get disciplined, unless you build some rhythms into your life. And you've talked about those on the podcast before. But in my experience in church leadership and in life in general, like I said before, time off at Christmas can feel like time off from God. So when, there's endless rounds of parties to go to, how do you keep your soul care routines going? I mean, the family are around, people are staying up late, getting up early, sleeping in different parts of the house. They're all, sleep in the lounge. How do you find space and find time to keep your routines going?
Yeah. Well, Duncan, I think there's a couple of things that are really important. I think the first thing that I would say, especially to those that are in church leadership or in some sort of vocational ministry, your relationship with God prior to the Christmas season has to be separated from the work that you do at the church. So if you're only spending time with Jesus in preparation for a message that you have to preach or a staff meeting that you have to lead, or if your time with Jesus is always connected to something you're doing vocationally, that's going to be problematic, not just in the Christmas season, but long-term in every season. I think that you've got to separate those two things. And I know for me, Duncan, for many years in ministry, my time with Jesus outside of what I was doing vocationally was incredibly limited. Yeah, I would spend a lot of time, preparing for messages or getting ready for a staff meeting or speaking at a conference or a camp. But outside of that, my time with Jesus was incredibly limited. And I just had it completely out of whack, where my doing for Jesus was far outpacing my being with Jesus. And ultimately that led me to really hitting a wall when it came to my relationship with God, because I wasn't allowing all that I was doing for Jesus to flow out of my being with him. So I would just say, first off, Duncan, you got to separate those two things. And that goes for people that are in vocational ministry, maybe not as primary for people that are not in vocational ministry.
So hang on, let's back the truck up a bit here, because there's an ouch here. What I do for Jesus oftentimes trumps just being with Jesus. That's kind of what you said. And I think as you say that, whether you're in full-time church ministry or you volunteer at your local church, I'm telling you that's an ouch right there, because oftentimes we feel like, I do so much for the church. I do so much for Jesus. I've got God and church around me all the time. And it's almost as if God is leaning over the balcony of heaven saying, "You're my precious child. I just want to hang with you. You don't have to do anything.
That's it.
Can you put the stuff down? Can we just walk on the beach? Can we just talk?"
Yeah.
And so, so I think Christmas is a wonderful time to, rather than seeing it as a time off, but a time on to rebuild and reframe and refresh this vibrant relationship with God. So how do you keep the routines going that you have through the rest of the year?
So separating those two things means then if I'm in vocational ministry or not in vocational ministry and Christmas season comes, those rhythms or practices that you have that allow you to sit at the feet of Jesus more than just doing things for Jesus, they may be interrupted as far as the consistency of the rhythm or the timing of those rhythms. For example, I honestly don't know, Duncan, when Christmas lands. Like, I'm not sure what day of the week it is this year, but some years it lands on a Saturday, which for us as a family, we practice a thing called Sabbath from Friday evening around 6 o'clock through to Saturday night. And so, sometimes your Sabbath rhythm will be maybe conflicted because people coming into town and you've got to host people and all of a sudden it's not as restful. So here's what I would say is not just Sabbath rhythm, but other rhythms in general. I would encourage you to be flexible with those, but not abandon them. I think
That's
that's
good.
the key. So yeah, pick a different day, or maybe at the end of, a busy season where you had a lot of parties back to back to back, or a lot of obligations back to back to back. Take a half a day and just Sabbath in the middle of the week if you've got the time off, or maybe Sabbath on a Sunday or in a different day, or even just change the amount of time that you pause just to be with Jesus. Maybe you can't do an entire 24 hours. Maybe you can only do 8 hours or 12 hours or something. But my encouragement would be flexible, but don't abandon them. And I think, Duncan, so oftentimes I would come back after the Christmas season back to work. And the old adage, like, I've been on holidays, but I need a holiday from my holiday. Like that's how I would come back at the beginning of maybe a ministry year in January, because I had abandoned my rhythms instead of being flexible with them. And so I would highly encourage people, be flexible, but don't abandon your rhythms over this season.
So let me ask you, because again, this is just a personal question. I mean, if anyone listens to this, great, but this feels like me talking to my mate and wanting to learn. But you talked about sitting at the feet of Jesus, and my mind goes straight to the whole Mary and Martha story. One was busy, one sat at the feet. Can you imagine? Can you just imagine for a moment what it must have been like to sit around his feet and to look up into his eyes and to listen to him speak? Wow.
Oh, yeah.
How do you do that, Jason Perkins? I want some of that in my life, and I struggle to connect in that way. How do you sit at the feet of Jesus, whether it's Christmas, Easter, or anywhere in between?
Yeah. I think I've shared this with you before, Duncan. And for those that maybe listen to the podcast, you might have heard this before, but I think God has given us this beautiful thing called an imagination. Yeah. And it's unique to us as human beings. We have this ability to think about our thoughts, and we can almost put ourselves outside of the scenario and be able to watch ourselves in like a movie set almost. We have this incredible ability. And so for me, Duncan, one of the things I do, and I do this on a regular basis, every morning, definitely, but even I pause a couple of times throughout the day as well, is I pause and I sit and I literally imagine, Duncan, in my mind's eye, Jesus sitting with me in the morning. So sometimes that looks like a cup of tea with my Bible, or just a cup of tea with my journal. And I just imagine that I'm there to listen to Jesus, who has been waiting up all night for me. Or if it's in the middle of the day, I have a pond in my neighborhood that I go to regularly. Throughout the day, I just pause from my work and I go sit on a bench down by the pond, and I imagine Jesus sitting on the bench with me. So we have this incredible ability to imagine. And I know for some people that are listening to this, because this is my story for so many years, that sounds a little bit weird. It sounds mystical. It sounds a bit bizarre. And I would have said 5 years ago, Duncan, I would have said, man, that he's kind of lost the plot if he's sitting there on a park bench imagining. But here's the genius of Christmas. This is the genius of Christmas. We are celebrating, Duncan, the moment when God showed how much he loved the world, that he left the glories of heaven to be with us. We use that word Emmanuel at Christmas time. We'll probably all sing this word Emmanuel at some point in a Christmas carol throughout the season. And it literally means that God is with us. And I think that is a special, special thing that we celebrate at this season. But I think it's one of those things that we can carry with us through every season, on any park bench, on any couch, on any dining room table, wherever it is. You can imagine Jesus literally with you because of Christmas.
I love that. I mean, you can imagine that. What would it look like if Jesus was actually with me now, wherever I am? And, poor old Rob Bell, I think sometimes gets a worse press than he deserves, the author Rob Bell. Yeah. And he has said some things that are right out there, and I don't agree with everything that he says. But when he talked about everything being spiritual, that was a game changer for me. because I had compartmentalized God into singing Christian songs, sitting in church for an hour on Sunday morning, going to my small group. That's where God lived and where God showed up. The rest of the time, when I played football or I watched TV or I was intimate with my family and with my wife, God was not involved in those kind of things. But what if everything was spiritual? What if God was everywhere?
Yeah.
You know, if you went to Jesus and you said to Jesus, how's your spiritual life? Jesus would say, I have no clue what you're talking about, because there was no word for spiritual. Everything was spiritual.
Yes.
You know, we chopped stuff up. So I think, you know, yes, it's important to go to the pond and have ponder time and imagine Jesus sat on the bench, but you can do it in traffic.
That's it.
You can be sat in your car at a stoplight and you can be thinking, Jesus is here with me now. You know, imagine that. Let's have a conversation with him. And the conversation changes, doesn't it? You know, it really does. Let me just throw this in, because this was a game changer. Again, a game changer for me. You know, oh, Jason, this David in the Psalms, in Psalm 27, David says, one thing I want from you, God. I'm sorry, this sounds a bit more like the Banksy podcast than the Perko podcast.
No, it's good.
Just one thing, and if you had a chance to ask God for one thing, you know, and David said, the one thing I want is I just want to be in your house. Yeah. Because if I hang around your house, I'll get to see how beautiful you are. Yeah. And you know as well as I know that David, just like you and me, had 100 questions he wanted to ask God for answer. But he said, no, forget the questions. I just want to be with you. Yeah. And then 5 chapters later in Psalm 32, God says, all right, I will direct your path. And this is how I'm going to do it, by keeping my loving eye on you. Yeah. So God will direct us, and he does it so if God will direct your life by keeping his eye on you, you better be seeking his face. Yes. Yes. And I've spent too long, Jason, it's confession time. Wow, I've spent too long seeking his hands. Yeah. And not long enough seeking his face. I've been seeking the hand, saying, gimme, gimme, gimme. I want answers. Yeah. And God says, do you want me for my, you know, have you got a passion for my person, or just do you want my plan? Do you want my answers? Is that all you're interested in? Yeah. And, you know, we treat God like some kind of cosmic Google. So I just think finding pond time or traffic time and imagining Jesus sitting at his feet all the time, because everything is spiritual. Oh, I'm sorry, I got off on a bit of a preacher's rant there, but it's a personal thing, really. Yeah.
Well, and I think this is the theme of Christmas, Duncan, that God wants to be with us. And then he promised that he would never leave us. He would never forsake us. But most of the time, Duncan, I spend many of my waking hours unaware of his presence. It's not that his presence isn't there. He is with me, but I'm just distracted by the things I need to get done, or the thing that I want to watch, or whatever it is that's distracting me from the awareness of his presence. And I just think that during the holiday season, being flexible, but not abandoning the rhythms that keep bringing you back to that awareness, keep bringing you back to his feet. I think that's the key in the holidays for taking care of your soul. Don't abandon them, but be flexible.
Be flexible with them. And that's a huge thought, isn't it? I mean, you know, if Star Trek was real and you and I could get beamed up to heaven, you'd think, wow, we'd be so close to God. But actually, God is already with us. We don't need to get beamed up to heaven. There'd be a few less distractions, sure. Yes. But he's already here. We don't need Scotty to beam us up to heaven, you know, because that the God of heaven is with us. That's what Christmas is. I love that. It's great. Hey, listen, I'm going to push this conversation on, because the other thing I struggle with at Christmas, and I'd love to get your take on this, is just extended. That sounds awful, doesn't it? This. I hope no one else listens to this that knows me, but it's that extended time with the family. Yeah. You know, I mean, I love my family, but you're suddenly pushed together for days on end. There's no respite. There's no relief. And I don't know what it's like in Australia, but for year after year after year, I've got a friend in my church who's a divorce lawyer. And he says his busiest time is January, February, March. The divorce rates, the separation rates go up, you know, because people are forced to be together at Christmas for 5 or 6 days and they realize they can't hack it anymore. Yeah. You know, you know what it's like. The in-laws are around, they're poking their nose in your business. I can remember I was on a Zoom call like this one Christmas, and my dad, who's 88, he comes in, he walks in and he's like, what are you doing here then? What's this? What's this for here? And it was like, Dad, go away. You know, and I had this blazing row with him on a screen over Christmas time. So, I mean, how do you deal with this, this relational, when mother-in-law is telling your missus how to cook the turkey and, oh, I wouldn't do it like that. And all the conflict rises and, how do you deal with that? Because that can be a distraction, and that can be painful, and that can last for months beyond Christmas.
Yeah. Duncan, I've got horror stories. I've got my own scars from Christmas time when things went poorly because of people's comments about a meal, or parenting techniques were different between one set of families and the others, and the cousins don't behave, all the things, Duncan. I've experienced all those things as well. I think one of the big keys, Duncan, has been helpful for me is I have some friends, Barry and Paula Davis, who they use this acronym, they call it FOOI, which is Family of Origin Impacts Everything. So FOOIE, Family of Origin Impacts Everything. So I've found that my response to things, even around the holidays, oftentimes comes from FOOI, Family of Origin Impacts Everything. And so I think one of the things that's been helpful for me around Christmas time, especially when we're getting our family of origin oftentimes together again after maybe long periods of not being together, and sometimes we're together for extended periods of time. One of the things that's been helpful is being aware of family of origin patterns and trends and things that oftentimes come up. So how your family of origin handled conflict is a big one. Some families of origin, they avoid conflict. And so everyone just walks on eggshells at Christmas time, trying not to upset Uncle so-and-so or Grandma so-and-so. Or sometimes families of origin, they go straight in with conflict. And so they want to talk about it. They don't want to avoid it. So I think being aware of your family of origin and how you handled conflict, I think that's a really important thing. And then I've found, Duncan, and you've heard this before, that every conflict is a gap between what was expected and what was experienced. And so that's then good. you end up filling the gap. And you've heard Andy Stanley talk about this. We end up filling the gap between what was expected and what was experienced. So you talk about that incident with your father. You expected your father not to come into the Zoom call the way that he did and grab the microphone and all the things that he did. But yet that's what you experienced. And so what do I fill that gap with? And so I think clarifying expectations is really, really critical. And I've come across this kind of 4-step tool that has been helpful for me, Duncan, in clarifying expectations. And the 4 steps, they're super simple. The first step is just this. It's making sure that the expectation is conscious, meaning, are people aware of it? Am I aware of the expectation? Are they aware of the expectation? Are we conscious of that? So that's the first thing. So when it comes to, I'll give you a practical example of that, Duncan. When it comes to the Christmas meal, is everyone aware of who's bringing what and whose kitchen are we doing it out of, and who's going to be involved in the kitchen and who needs to stay out of the kitchen? Do we set those expectations ahead of time, and are they aware of those? Are they a conscious expectation? Did you have a question, or did you?
No, I was just underlining that. I mean, that one thing alone is going to resolve so many conflicts, isn't it? You know, even just to be able to say, hey, Mum, last year, do you remember we had a bit of a fight because of this, that, and the other? I've got a brilliant way of making sure we don't do that. Just make sure that we do this instead. I think just clarifying that expectation is genius.
So
really
make
good.
Sure it's conscious. The second thing about an expectation is it's got to be realistic. So you can't say to somebody like, hey, we expect you to do the entire meal for 40 people. That's just not realistic in the size kitchen that you have or the amount of time. So make it realistic. Like, hey, we're all going to pull our weight, but yet Aunt Sally's going to coordinate the whole thing. That's the expectation. We're making it conscious and we're going to make it realistic. And then you've got to actually communicate it, Duncan. This, I know it sounds like, oh, we've already communicated it because everyone's aware of it, but make sure that it's communicated. And then, Duncan, this 4th one is the one that I've failed at so many times, not just at Christmas time, but in all relationships when it comes to expectation. This is where I have failed. I'll acknowledge this is the point that I didn't drive home. not only does it need to be conscious, not only does it need to be realistic and spoken, but it's got to be agreed to. Because
Yes.
I can text the family and say, hey, this is what's happening. And then, we said we were eating at 3:30 and Uncle Bob doesn't show up until 5 with his family. And we're all going like, where were you? We sent the text. But Uncle Bob never said yes to the 3:30 start. He was at somebody else's house. And that's why he showed up at 5. And so unless the expectation is finally agreed upon, it's really not an expectation until you get to that final stage. So those 4 things, Duncan, have been super helpful for me when it comes to not just Christmas expectations, but expectations in general. Make sure they're conscious, make sure they're realistic, they're spoken, they're communicated, and then they've got to be agreed upon or it's not a real expectation.
That's really helpful. I'm going to steal that and I'm going to use that and I'm going to put it into my own family this Christmas. Because like every family, I love being together with them, but especially the grandparents, they've got their own little ways. So, let me push you back a little bit to this idea of filling the gap. Do you fill it with trust or do you fill it with suspicion?
Yeah.
How can you be more positive? Because oftentimes it's about you want people to fit into your way of doing things. How can you build relationships and look at what other people enjoy and what other people love and say, hey, Grandpa, I don't like watching World War II black and white films, but I know you do. So on Tuesday night while you're with us, we're going to all sit down and watch it. I mean, how do you positively feed into building relationships and building good things with people?
Duncan, I think what you're talking about is this idea of exactly what Jesus did that we celebrate at Christmas time. We use this word within Christianity, this big word, incarnation, which is essentially God coming and dwelling with us, coming and being with us. And so I think what you're referring to is this idea of empathy, of curiosity, of getting into Grandpa's world and being willing to be curious and listen. I think this is key to what you're talking about. So what does it look like for me to maybe design a Christmas experience around the things that Grandpa loves and around the things that the rest of the family love, and not just have them fit into my mold of what Christmas should look like? But at the end of the day, Duncan, we've got to get into their shoes. We've got to get into their skin, just like Jesus did when he came into the world. He got into our skin. He got put on flesh. He put on skin. I've got to get into Grandpa's world in order for me to be able to do that. And I think the best way to do that is by asking great questions and being willing to listen. What are the things that Grandpa loves? What are the things that he longs for at Christmas time? What would make Christmas special for him this particular season? I think Jesus set the example for us and allows us to follow that.
I never thought about it like that. I never thought about Christmas is all about incarnation, Jesus becoming one of us, God becoming a man, getting into our world. I never thought about it as that's a brilliant way of releasing tension at Christmas, is that we get into Auntie Flo's world, we get into Brian's, Uncle Frank's world, we get into Grandpa's world. And we ask questions and show interest and give them worth and value. I love that, because otherwise they just get forgotten about and put to one side. I love that. That's so good. That's so good. So helpful. Listen, another confession. I want to move on from the family conflict thing. You've helped me a lot there. You've helped me a lot. It's really good. Give me some great tools. Another confession time. I know that at Christmas, if I'm not careful, I can go back to being a kid again, because I loved Christmas as a kid, and I can act childlike and fun, frolicky, but childish and selfish, and around Christmas I kind of revert back to my 10-year-old self. How can I, I'm a leader the rest of the time with my family, but I can get selfish at Christmas and want it to be about me. How can I be more grown up at Christmas is what I'm trying to ask you, I think.
Yeah. So Duncan, there's this concept that I've found to be really helpful. And the concept is this idea of differentiation. In some families, we talked about family of origin impacts everything just a moment ago. In some families, there was this idea of enmeshment, which means basically that if you towed the family line, then you were thought well of. So whatever the parents' values were, they were kind of passed on to the kids. And if you towed the line with those values, then you got rewarded, or you got thought well of, and that, you didn't get into trouble. And as adults, we can find ourselves, especially at Christmas time, reverting back to that enmeshment sometimes if we're not careful. So we show up at Christmas dinner, and all of a sudden mum walks in the door, and all of the values that you grew up with, you feel this weight, this burden, this responsibility to actually go along with everything that you grew up with. And yet as an adult, you don't necessarily hold the same values anymore. You have a spouse that came from a different family of origin, and so they have a different set of values, and you together perhaps have created your own values as a family. And so I think it's really important for us to learn the art of differentiation, meaning we can be our own person and be close relationally, even though we may be far apart philosophically or ideologically. And this is not just a family thing, Duncan. I think this is just a human thing of how do we differentiate ourselves from others, but still remain close to them relationally. So I can hold someone close relationally and love them, even though we may be far apart philosophically or ideologically. And that takes, I think, an incredible amount of work to really find what are your values? What are the things that you value? Because what I found is at Christmas time, when you get around family, is sometimes your values can start to be stressed or even broken, and you end up reverting back to whatever the values were in your family of origin just to keep the peace. So for me, Duncan, it's all about doing the work ahead of time of saying, who am I? I'm confident in that. I'm confident in who I am in Jesus. And that doesn't mean I have to change to be able to keep the peace at Christmas time.
I love that. Staying close relationally, but differentiating yourself maybe ideologically and philosophically from I love that. Yeah. And it's quite a hard thing to do. I mean, certainly and I don't know whether this is right or wrong, but in our family, there are just certain things that we don't talk about. So I don't know, you guys probably heard nothing about Brexit in Australia, but we left the European Union a few years ago, and it was the biggest bombshell of a generation. And my dad voted to leave, whereas we all voted to remain in the European Union. And it's just a subject. If you talk to my dad about Brexit, it's like setting light to a fire. He just goes mad, and it's unhelpful, and it all goes quiet afterwards. So it's just a subject we're ideologically completely different. I still love him. He's my pop. Still love him. But so we just steer clear of talking about that. If it comes on the TV, we switch it over, and we just make sure if he says anything about it, we just say, yeah, Dad, and we move, because he knows we think differently. I know he thinks differently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know the other thing, and I don't know whether, talking about these, this is a tough one. I've had quite a few families talk to me about their kids, and maybe you've not got there yet, but their older teenage kids who are sleeping with their boyfriends and girlfriends. I was talking to one family just the other day, and their daughter has moved out, and she's living with her boyfriend now. And of course, when they come back for Christmas, do you let them share a room?
I think,
or not?
Yeah, I think, Duncan, you're talking about the exact issue of differentiation. You're saying, hey, we're values, we're solid on them. We know what our values are. And we're not saying that we're going to impose those on you when you're outside of our home. But when we're in our home, these are our values. But again, Duncan, this goes back to that setting of expectations, clarifying expectations long before the conversation happens in the home, sitting down with that child and letting them know, we love you unconditionally. And we want to stay close to you relationally, even though ideologically and philosophically, we might be far apart on certain issues. We are going to stay close relationally. And so I think setting those expectations before they come home is going to be the thing that sets you up for success, to be able to say to them, hey, our values, we're not reverting to somebody else's values. We're holding ours, but we're also going to hold you close in relationship, even though we may be distant ideologically. I do think too, Duncan, one of the other things that is super helpful, I think it's important for us to really be willing to understand somebody else's point of view without having to push ours on them. If they have no interest in finding out where we're coming from philosophically on a different issue, that's up to them. But I think I've learned over the years that when I'm curious and when I really want to discover and even put myself into their shoes, I oftentimes find out that on an issue that I thought I was certain of, I have a completely different perspective when I get to know someone's story and the reason why they think the way they think on certain things. So I think that's a big part of this as well, Duncan, being willing to listen, to ask questions, to get their perspective, and even being open to change your mind on something that perhaps you held very strong views on.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, it feels like to me, it's about preferring the relationship to preferring the rules.
Yeah.
Because they know what the rules are.
Yeah.
And if the rules break the relationship, if the rules push the relationship away, you're going to hate yourself forever.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
I love that. Hey, listen, how do you help people who are lonely at Christmas? And I asked that question, and I know it's changing tack a bit, but again, in the UK, we were locked down last Christmas, and with this Omicron variant, Boris is trying to teach the whole world the Greek alphabet. So we've got to Omicron so far.
Yeah.
So with this new variant that's around, there's loads of question marks in the UK about when we get to Christmas, are we going to be locked down again? But last Christmas, there were so many stories in our country of elderly and young single people who were just locked indoors all on their own. And Christmas, that's a time that's supposed to be about family and supposed to be about friendship and supposed to be about parties and togetherness, became a really lonely thing. So how do you not feel alone at Christmas? For someone who is going to be on their own at Christmas, how do you not feel alone?
Duncan, I know we keep going back to this theme, but the theme of Christmas is God with us. Yes. And so even if I was stuck on a deserted island this Christmas, maybe some people might refer to Australia as a deserted island with all the restrictions, all the restrictions we've got going on with travel. But the frank reality is, even if I was Tom Hanks on the deserted island with only Wilson, I also have God's presence with me because Emmanuel has come to be with us. And so I would encourage you, if you're feeling lonely, that would be the first thing. Just the fact that Christ, his presence is with you and you can be with him, and remind yourself of that. That's the first thing I would encourage you to lean into, is you aren't alone. His presence is with you. I would encourage you though, Duncan, to be creative. Our family, my wife and I both have family that are spread all over the world right now. China, Vietnam, the US, here in Australia, multiple countries around the world. And we have the power of technology, which has just given us so many creative ways to be able to be together with other people at Christmas time. So I would really encourage you to lean in to the creativities of the technologies that we have available to you. But then the final thing I would encourage people to think about is, if you're lonely during this season, what could you do to potentially reach out to other people that are lonely during this season? And together you may find a warmth and a relationship during this season. So my wife this year has been quite not depressed, but quite discouraged around this season, because our family are all overseas right now, specifically her family. And so this year she got creative. And so instead of Thanksgiving, we hosted a Friendsgiving. And instead of it being on the Thursday that we would normally celebrate it in the US, we celebrated it on a Saturday. And we had about 20 people into our house for a Friendsgiving this year. And I tell you, it was the most beautiful 8 hours, Duncan. We started the meal at 3 p.m. and people didn't leave until 11 o'clock that night. And we literally sat around a table almost the entire time, playing games, laughing, eating food, just having a great time. And although it wasn't family, it definitely filled that loneliness void. And just reaching out to other people who may be feeling lonely during this season might be the very thing that causes you to not feel lonely as you step out of your comfort zone. So I would encourage you with that. But then the last thing I would say is for those, Duncan, that are on the listening to the podcast and they're not lonely, I think the awareness in your community that there are people this Christmas who need an invitation from you to be a part of whatever it is that you're doing, that may not be a family member, but they're in your community and you know that they're isolated or they're not connected. Man, I think what an incredible gift that you could give someone this Christmas, just to invite them to come and sit at your table and to be with them during this season where they might feel a little bit isolated and alone. So you may not be feeling lonely, but you may be able to give the gift of relationship this Christmas to somebody that is. I would encourage you to think about that.
That's so helpful, so practical. One last thing, and then I think our time is through. How do you? It's so helpful, this, Jason. My mind is buzzing. But so, how do you have you ever invited someone else into your Christmas soul care, as it were, your routines? Have you ever invited someone else to? You're trying to spend some great time with Jesus. Have you ever invited someone else to come and join you in that and to use Christmas as an opportunity to help people care for their souls?
Yeah. I actually think, Duncan, the entire reason we celebrate Christmas, as we've already said, is the fact that God chose to come and be with us. And there are some tools, there are some things around this, what we refer to as the Advent season, candle lighting, special prayers, special readings. You even said lighting the candle on Christmas morning and just reading the Christmas story. For some people, that may be their only connection to God during this season. That neighbor that you invite over for Christmas lunch that doesn't go to church, or that relative that is part of the Christmas gathering that is not connected to God, there's an excuse almost, and an acceptable, a society acceptable excuse that we have at Christmas time to be able to invite people into this incredible idea that God loved us so much that he came to earth because he wanted to be with us. He wanted to be in a relationship with us. So, Duncan, I've found that this season is honestly one of the easiest seasons to invite other people into some of these experiences, like a reading or maybe a candle lighting or some sort of story that you're able to share that talks about God wanting to be with us and the reason why we celebrate. I think this is an ideal time to be able to do that for sure.
We had, it's brilliant. We had one family in our church who lived in a 500-year-old manor house. Beautiful house, beautiful grounds. And it was like a Christmas wonderland. They would deck it out with the most amazing decorations. It had a gravel drive. It was a bit like an episode of Poirot, or as you drove up. It was an amazing place. And they would host, all before Christmas, they would host Christmas drinks and Christmas readings. That's all they called it, Christmas drinks. So you would turn up, you would have carol music was playing. Sometimes they even had a few carol singers on the driveway if the weather was okay. And there would be sherry and wine and drinks going around. And then at one point in the evening, just for 5 minutes, they would stop and someone would read the Christmas story.
Wow.
And they invited the whole village.
Wow.
They'd do it over a variety of different evenings.
Yep.
and invite. And I think you're absolutely right. Christmas is a great opportunity to show that God who's with you is also with them in their pain. And so, every time now she meets someone down the post office, or while she's out walking the dogs, she knows everybody because they all come around at Christmas for the story. That's great. Listen, you've made me feel very Christmassy today.
Good.
You've pressed me closer to Jesus. It's as if in the last half an hour or so you've held my hand and you said, Duncan, come walk with me, let's go spend some time with Jesus. And so I feel richer in my soul because of our conversation. And I am gonna forget the podcast. I am genuinely going to make some changes this Christmas so that I can spend time with the God who's with me. So thank you, Jason. You've done my soul good today.
Yeah, likewise, Duncan. I always enjoy our times together. I feel like just a couple of mates chatting about how to make Christmas even better this year than perhaps in the past, and ultimately spending more time with our Savior who we're celebrating. So thanks for all the questions, mate.
Well, thanks so much for hanging out with Duncan and I as we talked soul care at Christmas time. I hope there were some helpful things for you as you go into this Christmas season and care for your soul. I want to really encourage you to be flexible, but don't abandon all the powerful rhythms, all the helpful practices that put you at the feet of Jesus, especially during this season when he so badly wants to be with us. That's the reason why he came. That's the reason why we celebrate Christmas, because it's the time when God came into the world because he wanted to be with us, and he wants to be with us this Christmas. So I want to encourage you to make sure you plan to spend some time being with Jesus during this season. Hey, I also want to remind you that next episode, we're going to be talking with my good friend Sadara, and we're talking all about the new year. We're going to be setting some ideas or some direction for the new year on who we want to become, not just what we think we need to get done. In fact, I want to help you to discover who it is that God wants you to become in the new year and for the rest of your life, instead of focusing on what we so often do, the goals of what we want to get done. I believe that when we become the person that God wants us to become, everything we need to do will flow from that. So I want to encourage you to check out the next couple of episodes where I have these powerful conversations with Sadara. And I also want to encourage you that if you would like help in creating your own life manifesto or your own life dashboard, you can reach out to me at Jason Perko Perkins on Instagram. Click the link in the bio and you can connect with me on the form there, specifically about this life manifesto tool that'll be talked about on the next podcast. Well, listen, we're so grateful for your time. We love hearing from people that listen to the podcast and find these conversations helpful. So make sure you reach out to us and connect with us during the week. Also, we would love it if you would share these conversations with anybody that you think would find them helpful as well. The best way to do that is probably through your social media platform, or another helpful way to do it is to leave us a rating and review on whatever platform you listen to this episode on. All of those things help us to get the word out about these powerful conversations to as many people as possible. Our dream here at the podcast is super simple. We want to see an entire generation of leaders reach their goals and at the same time hear them say, "It is well with my soul." Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Merry Christmas to you. I hope you have a wonderful time celebrating Christmas this year. I look forward to connecting with you online this week and next week as we dive into a great conversation about the new year with my friend Sadara. Until then, cheers.